afternoon. Well, that was quite a harrowing trip yesterday. You know, a fire in the control tower is about as bad as it gets in O'Hare. I have a 7:10 flight out this evening, and we'll see what happens then. Let's see. This isn't quite right. Can you somehow get the right projection? You have the... I'd like to thank Bill and the organizers of the meeting for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I represent a very large team of researchers from many institutions, some of which are shown here. Actually, the Southern California Earthquake Center has quite an extensive collaboration, and this is sort of the central sort of IT group, HPC group in. Thank you. And what I'd like to talk about is the problem of earthquake prediction. Now, I should say we can't predict earthquakes. Earthquakes are wonderfully complex cascades of events, as shown here. This is just for a single event, but typically involve many different earthquakes, a preparatory phase, as well as then a sudden fault rupture, and then all hell breaks loose, and lots of bad things happen if that earthquake is near inhabited areas. We have, even though we can't predict earthquakes, we do have a number of technologies that can help us forecast earthquakes and understand their effects, and these are listed down below, on this sort of funny nonlinear time axis where it's centered at the earthquake event time. And I'd like to kind of go through some of the contingent questions that arise when we're trying to deal with the earthquake problem. For example, in the very long term, many years before an earthquake, we want to be able to anticipate that we're going to have earthquakes so we can design structures appropriately. And we therefore have to know the level of hazard. We have to know the shaking intensity that will happen during an earthquake. When we have earthquake sequences, the probabilities of earthquakes change by factors of 1,000 or so. For example, when we have large aftershock sequences or sequences of multiple large events. And there are new techniques for helping us forecast how those probabilities change. When an earthquake starts to happen, instruments can begin to detect that it's happening and can relay that forward. We need to be able to predict what shaking might occur in the few moments during an earthquake. And then, of course, after things are all over, we have to understand what exactly has happened. All of these problems benefit from large-scale simulation, but I'm going to focus on the first one of these. I'm going to focus on the long-term seismic hazard analysis or probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. These typically involve low probabilities. As we move down that chain of events, we go to higher probabilities. And the fact we're dealing with low probabilities puts special considerations for how we compute and forecast these effects. So probabilistic seismic hazard analysis is the basic technology that we use, and it comprises a couple of components. The most basic is the earthquake rupture forecast. We have to know where the faults are, how often they might rupture, the size of earthquakes they will produce, and so forth. So that we call an earthquake rupture forecast. And then if we can, in fact, anticipate the intensity of the shaking that those events cause, we can produce probabilistic maps of, over the long term, of how much shaking you might expect to experience. And if you're designing a building or preparing a population for large earthquakes, this is an essential step. Now, in order to make a seismic hazard map and render seismic hazard curves, we have an intermediate step, which is to take the earthquake rupture forecast and then, conditional on the probabilities of certain ruptures happening, being able to forecast the shaking that those ruptures cause. So that's sort of the ground motion prediction problem. And currently, that is being done very empirically. This shows you, this is an older result, but it shows you exactly what goes on. This is a function of distance, and you're looking here at recorded earthquake data and some intensity measure, in this case, peak ground acceleration. Now, what you will notice is, of course, the intensities decay as you go to a larger distance. The waves spread out and they dissipate with time. However, the data have some features which are problematic. First of all, there's very little data in near the sources and over the range of source parameters. Secondly, the data that do exist have very high variability. We call this aleatory variability, sort of the scatter within the system level model of the earthquake. Now, we believe that much of that aleatory variability and a lot of our uncertainty in making the forecast, that is the epistemic uncertainty, come from three-dimensional heterogeneities in the Earth that we're not modeling in these empirical methods. And of course, we have a huge amount of information about the three-dimensional structure. This is a picture of Southern California. I'm going to use Southern California as a natural laboratory. So here's Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, San Diego. You'll see lots of pictures of Southern California. What this is showing you is a rendering of the depth of sedimentary basins. These basins act as waveguides. They act as essentially big bowls of jelly that shake during earthquakes and therefore very much affect the motion. We have much of this kind of information. For example, there's been a lot of exploration for oil and, of course, water in Southern California, and that gives us very good information on these types of structures. And we have lots of other information as well. So the idea is to try and combine this into three-dimensional models of crustal structure and then to be able to simulate what happens during an earthquake. So here's an example of a simulation. This is one that's a sort of famous simulation we did a few years back. So-called shakeout scenario, because it's been used in big emergency preparedness exercises in California. This is the San Andreas Fault, and this rupture corresponds to about a 300-kilometer length of the San Andreas Fault. Here's Los Angeles here. San Andreas Fault is some distance away from Los Angeles. This is a picture of the ground motions indicated by the colors, sort of the horizontal amplitude of ground motions, about 10 seconds after the rupture. So the rupture initiated down here in the Imperial Valley. It's going to propagate up this fault to about this point. As it propagates, of course, it's generating seismic waves, and those waves spread out. You'll notice that there's a very large amplitude pulse that's leading the wave train. This is the so-called directivity pulse, a big interference effect. And that propagates up the fault. But then when it reaches up near the San Bernardino, something kind of funny happens. Part of that energy takes a left-hand turn and is funneled into the Los Angeles basin. This is by the deep sedimentary valleys that lie south of the San Gabriel Mountains. And what you then see, this is at 1 minute 25 seconds, here's a picture at a couple of minutes after the event, is that you've generated a lot of very strong ground shaking in the Los Angeles basin. So this earthquake some distance away, through a phenomenon called directivity basin coupling, gives rise to very large shaking. So we'd like to be able to model this. We have an extensive program of simulation, and I'm going to kind of go through the basic structure of that program using what I'll call computational pathways. So we're going to start off, we have to have an earthquake rupture forecast. That in itself is a very interesting topic. I'm not going to describe the details of the earthquake rupture forecast just because of the time. I have a flight at 7:10. But let me just say that we just finished producing a new rupture forecast for California. This is called the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast version 3, done with a team from SCAG, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the California Geological Survey. It's the most advanced earthquake rupture forecast we have, and it's being incorporated into the 2014 revisions of the National Seismic Hazard Map. We did the runs for this particular model, which involves some very large inverse problems on TAC Stampede. Now, what we would like to be able to do is to eliminate this step. And in fact, the main goal of our research on blue waters has been to replace these empirical ground motion prediction equations with essentially simulation-based models. Now, to do that, what we have to do, we have other computational pathways. We take the earthquake rupture forecast, instead of pumping it through these equations, we use that to generate what we call an extended earthquake rupture forecast that includes a bunch of kinematic fault ruptures. These are representations of the details of how the rupturing occurs along the fault. Then it goes into an anelastic wave propagation code that propagates those waves away from the fault to various places. This is done through very detailed three-dimensional structures. If necessary, we apply nonlinear site response to get the ground motions from which we can calculate the intensity measures. Now, would it were it was that simple, I'm going to show you results from Blue Waters for this very large-scale calculation and in what we call the Cybershake project. So this will be the subject of most of my talk. But I want to point out that there's lots of uncertainties here. In particular, how do we make these kinematic fault ruptures? That requires an understanding of the fault rupture dynamics, and there's a separate computational pathway that we use for exploring that. We don't have to propagate the waves too far, but we have to propagate them in the vicinity of the fault because those waves interact with the fault to cause dynamic complexities during the very nonlinear process of rupture. That's pathway 3, and we've been doing our team's been doing some very interesting work at Oak Ridge on Titan using a very detailed high-resolution dynamic rupture models. Well, in order to be able to do these calculations, you have to have that three-dimensional structure of the Earth, so you need some sort of a structural representation. And to get that structural representation, you have to synthesize a bunch of data. You've got to assimilate the earthquake data you have, combine it with other types of data through a process we call full 3D tomography. And we have recently produced new models for Southern California on Argonne's Mira machine that involve hundreds of millions of hours of 100 million CPU hours in order to be able to do the many simulations necessary to generate these kinds of models. I won't be talking about those in detail. I'm going to focus on the Blue Waters calculations. So the Cybershake hazard model is one of the basic products that we do here at NCSA. And the model I'm going to be talking about is for the Los Angeles region. This is the area, so downtown LA will be here somewhere. The little white dots represent sites where the detailed calculations are done. There's about 283 sites in the Los Angeles area. We use all of the ruptures from the current version of the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast within 200 kilometers. So that means faults out and around the Los Angeles region, not just in the Los Angeles region. We have to not only to simulate a rupture on a fault, we have to simulate many ruptures on a fault. We have about 415,000 rupture variations for each one of these white dots, and that means we generate about 235 million seismograms per model. Now, why do we need so many seismograms? Well, as I said, it's not just one. If you have a piece of a fault that's going to rupture, there's lots of ways it can rupture. For example, it can start, let's just take an example for the San Andreas, similar to the one I showed you. It can start down here on the southeastern end of the San Andreas and propagate to the northwest, in which case you get this directivity pulse coupling into the Los Angeles, giving very high levels of ground shaking. On the other hand, it could start at the other end of the fault, propagate from the northwest to the southeast, in which case Los Angeles doesn't get very strong ground motion, but Mexicali gets hammered. So you have to be able to represent the start point or hypocenter of the earthquake at many places along the rupture. Moreover, the actual rupture process, as I pointed out, is a dynamically very complex process that is parameterized using the dynamic rupture simulations into what we call pseudodynamic models. This shows you some renderings of just examples of major faults in Southern California, and what we've done here is just illustrated typical slip functions. So you have high slip patches, small slip patches, and so forth. This is a very stochastic process, and one we have to represent by many realizations. Now, to account for this type of variability requires, in the case of the Los Angeles region, as I said, there's about 14,000 separate ruptures we consider. With those rupture variations in hypocenter and type, we end up with about 415,000 different earthquake ruptures that we'd like to model. And we can't do 415,000 simulations, even on Blue Waters. These are very large-scale simulations. So it would be nice if we could let's take these sources, source 1, do a simulation, source 2, do a simulation, source 3, and so forth, up to 415,000, but that's too expensive. In order to do M sources within sites, we have to do M simulations. So in this case, M equals 415,000. However, the ground motion only needs to be calculated at a much smaller number of sites. 283 in the Los Angeles area gives you actually pretty good resolution because we have good interpolation schemes. What we can do is we can turn the problem around, pretend there is a source at the site. So we use the principle of seismic reciprocity. This is just the time-space reversal symmetry of the wave equation. We generate a simulation as if there were forces acting at the site and propagating to these various source locations, we can then generate synthetic seismograms at this site by simple quadrature over the source. And it's very easy to take one of those wave fields and do 415,000 quadratures. So in order to get, let's say, 2 components of motion, which I'll be showing you the 2 horizontal components, it would require 2 N simulations, where N is the number of sites. So that's a factor of over 1,000 reduction in the computational cost. We call these wave field simulations that we do at a particular site the strain green sense, where we actually have to build up a tensor-valued quantity. And that's where the bulk of the calculation occurs. So this shows you we got this going on Blue Waters last year, and this shows you the workflow that we used last year. This is for what we call study 13.4, which means it was done in March of 2013. We have to generate a mesh, 1 job for each of those 283 sites. We then have to do this SGT computation. That requires 2 wave field simulations per site for horizontal components. And originally, our codes were not GPU capable, so we were just using CPUs. We then took these big SGT calculations and transferred them to another computer, in this case to TAC Stampede, where we actually did the post-processing, all those integrations over the different sites. That's a big data transfer, 57 terabytes. That generates the seismograms, which we then transferred to USC, HPCC, where we actually do the hazard product generation. This year, we've been able to do runs in a different way. In cooperation with the NCSA staff, we've been able to get the entire calculation onto the machine, where we do both the main SGT calculation and the post-processing. And we have got our codes now that are GPU capable. So this has really reduced the time to solution for our calculations. This shows you some of the history. Let me just point out those 2 runs, the 2013 and 2014 runs. We go from, what we mean by make span here is just the total time, wall clock time from the start of the calculation to the end. And in 2013, that was about 2 months. That's now been reduced by using the heterogeneous architecture of Blue Waters down to about 2 weeks. So it's a tremendous savings, really makes this a very practical thing to do. And this is a good time to point out that this type of research really does require deep collaborations between geoscientists, in our case, and computational scientists and people that work at NCSA. And I think we've seen the benefit of that close collaboration. Our calculational platforms, 4 of which are shown here, we've certainly benefited from those interactions in terms of being able to do the calculations. And I think trying to do these calculations has benefited the system because it has helped to integrate these various layers of cyber infrastructure. So when we come forward, we say, well, we have to have workflow management tools on Blue Waters. Then the Blue Waters team installs Gram that allows us to do remote job submission. That really is a big win for us and also a win for Blue Waters. We, of course, generated lots of congestion protection events because we had some bad internal I/O in our codes. Working with Blue Water staff, we've been able to correct that and avoid that type of I/O congestion. So let's look at some results. This compares the 2 models. One is a pure one-dimensional model. So what we've done here is we've done the full Cybershake calculation, again, 240 million seismograms, but using just a one-dimensional structure of the Earth, assuming that it is just a layered structure. We put in the best model we possibly can for Southern California, and then we compare that with the results where we put in our best 3-dimensional model. And you can see the difference in these hazard maps. So these maps are showing you essentially the level of shaking that you would expect with a probability of 2% in 50 years. That's a standard kind of engineering measure of shaking probability. And what you will notice is that, for example, in the 1D model, you see very large values along the San Andreas Fault. Obviously, there are lots of big earthquakes there. Of course, there's other faults generating earthquakes, but the biggest ones occur on the San Andreas Fault. In the 3D model, you don't see those high amplitudes, and the reason is the waves that are being generated, those directivity pulses, are being scattered. They're being scattered, for example, into sedimentary basins through this process of directivity basin coupling, and that gives rise to very large amplitudes in the near-fault basins. I recommend you do not live in San Bernardino. But also, Los Angeles has much higher shaking intensities because of those three-dimensional structures. And then finally, we see that in places, the hard rock regions like these mountains, the intensities are actually considerably lower than in the 1D model, again, because of the scattering effects. Now, I can't go into too much detail, but let me just say that, and I won't try to explain the details of this slide, but let me say that with such a large number of simulations, you can do some very interesting averaging operations that essentially conform to the seismological hierarchy of slip variations, hypocenter variations, sources, and sites. And from that type of averaging, you can recover, I mean, all this stuff is being generated by solving the wave equation. So that's very different from the way engineers do it, where they actually have specific terms and empirical equations that represent different effects. In our case, all those effects are mixed up together. But with these averaging techniques, we can sort them out. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the variance, the amount of variability we see in the ground motions. And what I'm showing you here is the variance once we have corrected for the current set of GMPEs that are used in the National Seismic Hazard Maps. And what we see is that there is residual variance, and by these averaging operations, we can partition that variance into different terms, into a site term, path term, directivity terms, magnitude variability terms, and slip complexity terms. When we add these things up, we see that it matches the residual variance in the NGA model. That's sort of a form of validation that the ground motions that we are generating in Cybershake are similar to the types of ground motions that go into the NGA analysis. But it tells us much more. It tells us, for example, that these residuals in the site and path effect are because the NGA models are not properly modeling those effects. And what that says is that if we get better models, if we believe our models and confirm them by validation studies, that we should be able to reduce the epistemic, or reduce our uncertainty in these models, the epistemic variance, by something like a factor of 2. Now, that turns out to be a really big deal, because if I plot now a hazard curve that shows the probability of exceeding some ground motion level as a function of that ground motion level, the current GMPs give us something like this red curve with the residual variance of about 0.62. What I've just shown you is that we can reduce that variance by a factor of 2. That means reducing the standard deviation by about a factor of 1/3. And that gives rise to something like a 50 times reduction in the exceedance probability. And when you are trying to deal with seismic hazard, that is a very big deal. For example, in California, one company, Pacific Gas and Electric, has 60 dams that have to be seismically retrofit. It's going to take them 30 to 50 years. It's going to cost about $60 billion. And being able to reduce the uncertainty in these types of calculations is literally worth billions of dollars. What I showed you was sort of a schematic curve. Here's some actual curves from the latest Cybershake runs shown in red. Other runs are shown in other colors, but in these bold lines with symbols, and comparing them with the current attenuation relations that are used in the national map. And you can see this reduction occurs in the case of the downtown Los Angeles site. Again, a very large reduction in probability, primarily owing to this reduction in aleatory variability. Now, there are other places where Cybershake actually gives larger numbers than the NGA values, such as in San Bernardino, because of these effects that are not in the current model, namely the directivity basin coupling. Well, okay, we have a predictive model, but of course, as one of the speakers emphasized this morning, we have to be able to verify these models and we have to be able to validate their results. And in this type of system science, you're constantly going from simulation to validation to data assimilation, verification, and around again. And as you go, you're incorporating more information, you're building in better physics, and of course it requires more computation. So I'm going to show you quickly an example of a validation experiment. We just had a couple of earthquakes in Los Angeles. They're not huge earthquakes. The La Habra earthquake at the end of March was a magnitude 5.1, shook people up a little bit. But what I'm showing you here are synthetic seismograms in red from the Cybershake base model, from the structural model, compared with the actual data shown in black. And there's for 3 Cybershake runs. This is the one we did in 2011. Here's 2013. And here's our latest run, 2014, in the middle. And what you will notice is that the ability to reproduce, to be able to predict these waveforms, is getting pretty darn good. Now, this is at low frequencies, but as I spin around and look at various sites, you will see there are variations in amplitude, there are variations in phase, but you'll notice how well the phases are locked. In fact, on all 3 components, we see good phase reproduction as well as amplitude reproduction. And this tells us lots of things. For example, it tells us that the seismic velocities are not laterally variable in terms of their anisotropy. So there's not the anisotropy that we see other places in the Earth that's significant for this wave propagation. That's good because it's expensive to compute anisotropy. If we look at all of the stations in Southern California, over 300 stations, and make a map of how well we do, you can see that this latest model has lots of red and yellow colors. That means it's doing a very good job of predicting those waveforms. Here's another earthquake, one that occurred just a little over a week before the La Habra event, one in Encino, California, and again, you see the very good waveform matches. We need to push this to higher frequencies. We're doing that. We're using earthquakes at higher frequencies. I won't talk about the details, but the push towards higher frequencies is the direction that's important to us. In fact, we plan to move from our current runs about 0.5 hertz up to eventually 2 hertz. We think we'll have 1 hertz runs sometime this year. We'll be adding more ruptures through the new USURF3 rupture model. We want to go statewide, sampling California. This is actually a seismicity-weighted sample. It looks like it's a population-weighted sample. People tend to live in places where there tend to be big earthquakes. And so this would give us a California-wide model. To do this, we have to be able to solve some physics problems. We're in the process of doing that. For example, as we go to high frequencies, we know the attenuation becomes frequency dependent. That's now in our models. We now have fault roughness calculations. I showed you some results from Titan. And we're putting in near-fault plasticity, soil nonlinearities, and near-surface heterogeneities. These will all increase the computational time, but we think we can keep that in a feasible range. For example, to do California-wide is within the capabilities of Blue Waters, as the numbers down below there show. Let me just close with showing you one calculation that uses a nonlinear representation of the medium, both near the fault, through the wave propagation, and near the surface. And what you'll notice is when you put in this plasticity effect, you reduce the amplitudes of the shaking forecast from that shakeout simulation I showed you earlier by a considerable magnitude. Now, this is problematic from Cybershake because we're using reciprocity, and reciprocity depends on the linear physics. But it turns out that most of the plastic effects, most of the nonlinear effects, are occurring right near the fault and right near the surface. And so most of that wave propagation is in the linear domain, and we can parameterize the nonlinear effects using a current representation. So here are our conclusions. I won't read them, and just close and be happy to answer questions. Thank you. Southern California, locally, that's not much of a problem. There is the Cascadia subduction zones in the north, and our group has done simulations of that event. On the other hand, if you were doing a Cybershake model for Japan, you would certainly have to include the offshore events, and you would certainly be interested in the tsunamigenic potential of those events. Yes.
Just to pick up on that, there are groups that are doing tsunami simulations. Of course, they use input, so you can imagine, like in hurricane modeling, you know, the wind fields going into storm surge models, and there must be pipelines like that, right?
Tsunami simulation is actually pretty easy because the water is pretty homogeneous material, and so you primarily have to know essentially the boundary conditions. There is a lot of nonlinearity associated with the tsunami run-up, which requires very detailed nonlinear physical simulations, but those can be done.
I have is, do you also study
It's interesting that the mid-continent part of the country has just lit up in the last few years. There is now a factor of 30 higher seismicity in the mid-continent than there was just a few years ago, and that's because of human activity, primarily deep injection of waste fluid. So that's an important prediction problem, and being able to understand the seismic hazard from those sources is very important. So these techniques are fully extensible to anywhere in the world. In fact, we're testing them in Southern California, but I would predict within 10 years this will be the standard way of doing probabilistic seismic hazard analysis.
Oh, there's one more question, sir.
There's one of validation. Presumably there are a lot of historic earthquakes. Why don't you use it?
Yeah, we use all the information we can from historical earthquakes. Unfortunately, in the San Andreas system, we don't have any really big earthquakes that have been recorded by modern instrumentation. The last really big earthquake in the San Andreas system was in 1906 in San Francisco. The last one in Southern California was 1857. So we just don't have any recordings. That's why simulation is so important. What we do is we simulate earthquakes in other places like Japan where they do have big earthquakes, use that to validate simulations, and then hopefully that's transportable back into Southern California.